welcome back to another episode of Sorry for Rambling. As always, I'm Alex Cack, and I'm joined today by Don Blankenship, the Constitution Party's nominee for the U.S. presidency in 2020. Don, thank you for coming on the program. How you doing?
I'm doing fine, thank you.
A pleasure to have you here. I think you are, I've been doing a whole slew of these presidential interviews, and I think you're my last one. So
Okay.
let's just jump right into it. You're running on the Constitution Party line. How long have you been a member of the Constitution Party?
I guess for a little over 2 years, I ran for the West Virginia Republican U.S. Senate seat in May of 2018, and then shortly after that, I joined the party, Constitution Party.
Now, if you don't mind asking, what is it that caused you to join the party? What was it that appealed to you about the Constitution Party as opposed to the Republican Party or any of the other many third parties on the right?
Well, I had been in the Republican Party for most of my life. In fact, the entire family had, and I had done a lot of donations and a lot of work for the Republican Party. And then I ran for the U.S. Senate seat, as I mentioned, from West Virginia as a Republican. And Mitch McConnell and some of the Republican Senatorial Committee decided that they preferred that I not win, so they went out of their way to make sure I didn't. And after that, I decided I liked the Constitution Party better. But really, the difference between the two parties, I think, is the Constitution Party has a lot more stick-to-itiveness to its principles than the Republican Party does.
When you say stick-to-itiveness of its principles, what specifically are you referencing? Which principles are you referencing?
I guess among those would be the principle of honesty and integrity, the principle of supporting the Constitution and the rule of law, the principle of being a true conservative and being concerned about the national debt and many of the other issues that are plaguing the country. So I felt like they were much more in line with my views of what needed to be done to fix the country.
Yeah, it's an interesting kind of deviation point I think you strike there, because the one thing that struck me, I mean, if you go back even 10 years ago, the Constitution Party was kind of one of the banner third parties, and it feels like it's decreased in visibility over the last maybe decade, and I've personally thought that part of that had to do with the fact that it's a paleo-conservative party, and the Republican Party on a national basis has moved in that direction pretty quickly. But you touched on something there about honesty and integrity. Now, is that something that you feel, looking at national figures like President Trump or Mitch McConnell, like you said, is that something that you feel that they're lacking?
Yes, very much so. I think the party has sort of lost its way in that regard. What happens is if the Democrats tell an effective lie, the Republicans feel like they have to tell a better one. So we've gotten into a contest about who can be most dramatic as opposed to who can come up with the best policies for the country. And we don't solve any problems anymore. There's I guess, an opportunity presented to the two major parties to continue the arguments as opposed to resolve them.
Now, you talk about kind of solving these problems. Do you see yourself as someone who would politically work with opponents or people from other parties to draft legislation or compromise, or do you see yourself someone who's committed to certain policies and ideals?
I think I'm committed to policy and ideals, but I think I can influence how other people see the policies that I believe in. I had a conversation yesterday, this is sort of anecdotal, but a conversation with a young man that, he was a minority guy, a black guy who was real upset about the shooting here recently. And I was explaining to him that the Democratic Party platform is exactly contrary to the best interest of the minority groups and the underprivileged in the country. And we got to talking about illegal immigration, and I explained to him that the minimum wage is depressed and will remain depressed as long as illegal immigration is allowed to continue at the volume that it is. And so we got to talking about different issues, and he was quite taken by the different perspective of what was in the best interest of the underprivileged.
Now, and you talk about illegal immigration needing to be stopped due to its effect on wages. How would you propose stopping people coming here without proper documentation?
Well, again, I think Trump's ideal of the wall and of controlling the borders either electronically or with troops or with the wall, physical wall, whatever, is the first step. Again, you're right on a subject that I think I can use to make my point that I'm a compromiser from the standpoint of getting results and fixing the problems, but I'm also staunch in my views as to illegal immigration. The idea that we're going to deport several million people, including DACA uh, members, is not going to work. You have to be practical in any solution you come up with, and so that would include figuring out exactly how DACA people become either citizens or have a path to citizenship. At the same token, sanctuary cities have to be ended, the wall has to be built, and we have to begin to vet or to effectively monitor who comes into the country and get a lot of people to come into the country that can contribute to making America stronger as opposed to making it weaker.
You mentioned ending sanctuary cities at the same time you mentioned, pathways to citizenship for undocumented folks. Those two things, in some ways, don't seem to need to be said. If you had an effective pathway to citizenship, there wouldn't be sanctuary cities. There wouldn't be a discrepancy there.
Yes and no. I mean, there's a lot of people come into the country that would be deported for crimes or whatever. So those people, I think, should be deported. I think the sanctuary cities need to end whatever the law is. They need to help enforce it. Currently, the law is, of course, you can't be in the country undocumented. But the bottom line is there's room to find an agreement there that strengthens the country, and the objective should be strengthen the country, not win the argument or continue the issue so that one party can attract certain elements of the population's vote and the other elements of the country's vote.
Well, and I think that kind of gets to that point that I was driving there is when we talk about something like immigration, there used to be some broader consensus amongst the two major parties and even with the smaller ones that the issue wasn't the enforcement. That was the soundbite that played well with audiences. It was the simple answer. The reality, of course, was not that there was an enforcement issue. It was that we had a system issue. The system was broken down. It was very hard for people to get here who wanted simply to work or who were looking for a safer life. At the same time, the same people that may be committing crimes or involved in, say, narcotics or firearms trafficking tended to have money and connections to get over the border legally without issue. That still is the case today when you look at the actual breakdown of the numbers. So that seems something where we need a policy. We need an overhaul of the system. When you talk about things like sanctuary cities or a wall, those things are all ancillary. It seems like we're talking about addressing symptoms instead of trying to fix the kind of origination point of the issue. Would you agree with that?
No, I'm afraid I wouldn't agree. I think that the law is the law. Sanctuary cities are, in my mind, breaking the law by not reporting illegal immigrants, and that they're hurting the country while this policy is being sorted out. It's exactly, you're right to some extent that they're symptoms, but when you start to address them, you will find more pressure on the major parties and or the legislature and the establishment to fix the problem. So long as the problem does not affect one side or the other because they're violating the law, it'll be hard to get the impetus on it to fix it. So they work hand in hand. I think the bottom line is that there's room for compromise. Neither side wants to compromise because they're using the issue, as they often do, to attract supporters to one side or the other.
Well, you're talking about, for example, pathways to citizenship for people that are already here. But what about people who have not come here yet?
Again, I think that the process needs to be quicker. It needs to be more objective as opposed to subjective. It needs to be based on something other than who you know or whether you can find the connections to get in. But whatever that policy is, it would be developed through negotiation, both sides and everybody that's involved. And I don't mean that undocumented people would be allowed to stay here. I mean that people such as DACA, where they really don't have any place to be deported to, would obviously need to have a path to citizenship. It's not practical that people that came here as children are going to be deported. And as long as one side is saying you deport everybody, and the other side is saying you let everybody in, both sides are going to be wrong, and the country's going to suffer.
What are other policies that you'd like to pursue?
Well, I think that we need a project to, of course, the Constitution Party and myself are strongly opposed to abortion. I think we need a more help to people that can't afford the children, because most abortions are, for economic reasons. And we also need to do everything we can to improve technology to make it easier and more likely you can abort the pregnancy without aborting the child. I think that we need to take a very serious look, even though it's now out of vogue, so to speak, at how we're going to get our spending and under control and get a balanced budget. I think you can do that. I think fundamentals that have been talked about forever and ever, like term limits, can be achieved. I believe that as president, I could convince congressmen to pass legislation or to help achieve a constitutional amendment to set up term limits. But basically, we got to get rid of the corruption. We got to hold legislators, Congress, president, everybody to the same laws, and we can't be having slush funds to get rid of sexual harassment cases or hide things. And we also, if we're ever going to have a country that's a true democracy or republic, we're going to have to do away with these things called Hill committees, which allows the government to run political action committees and raise horrendous amounts of money to prevent non-establishment candidates from winning elections.
There's an interesting kind of trend I'm noticing here in this conversation we're having. The Constitution Party, once upon a time, was often considered to the right of the Republican Party. Yet a lot of the things that you're talking about are frankly probably more moderate than what you would see from today's GOP. Do you feel that the Constitution Party or has shifted, or your candidacy is shifting it maybe more towards the center, or simply do you think that the Republican Party has just kind of gotten out past you guys as far as that kind of more rightward cultural shift?
I think that I'm not always in perfect alignment with the Constitution Party, but I do think I'm further right than Republicans are by far. I differ some with the Constitution Party on occasion, not what the ultimate goal is, but what the steps are that are necessary to get there. And that's where I am on a lot of these issues. I think that we have to be pragmatic if we truly want to make a difference. And many times that takes a compromise that maybe violates the ultimate goal.
Well, for example, your suggestion on the issue of choice that you made at kind of the top of that last segment, you were talking about increasing, financial programs and incentives for people who may be considering an abortion. That's kind of like the Jimmy Carter playbook on that issue. Do you find that you're having pushback within the Constitution Party on that type of policy proposal? Do you view yourself as maybe out of step with other conservatives, or are you simply just proposing an alternative way to tackle this kind of broader ideological issue?
I think I'm a little bit out of sync with the Constitution Party on that in the near term. I think that, I'm not necessarily suggesting that the mother be given funding as much as I am, that the ease of adoption be much greater, and that the child born into the world without a parent that wants it, is somehow benefited. But I don't like that. But until we fix the problem in another way, we have to choose between the reality of today and what might make it better. And same thing with illegal immigration, abortion, even balancing the budget. You got to make progress in order to achieve the ultimate goal.
A lot of what I'm hearing from you does sound like, you use the term pragmatic. You're talking a lot about kind of consensus approaches to policy, trying to find areas where different stakeholders could agree on different portions to craft a single piece of legislation, which is a lot of what our whole legislative process is based off of, and yet that seems to be out of vogue and kind of away from the norm of what we're seeing in American politics today. Do you think that there's a coalition of voters who are looking for a candidate like yourself who is willing to moderate certain stances or to work with different people with different views?
Yes, I think that if I had the same ability to be, on the media programs and to speak to the American people and so forth that the two major parties have, I would win the election quite easily. I mean, in 2014, I basically espoused in a documentary something that's very close to Donald Trump's policy, knowing that the blue collar workers in this country had been abandoned by the Republicans and the Democrats. The Democrats had put in so many regulations, the blue collar jobs couldn't survive, and the Republicans had decided to turn our wealth and so forth over to China in the trade policy. And Trump recognized that. And that's one of the reasons he was able to get elected. The American people are disappointed in the president. They're scared of the Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer types. What they're looking for is the opportunity to take care of themselves and to work and to have prosperity and to be safe in their homes and so forth. And it's not complicated. Any issue that lessens the strength of the United States and hurts the country is bad for all Americans. And the trade policy has been that, the immigration policy has been that, and trying to police the world has been that.
Do you view yourself as a free trader or more of a fair trader?
Much more a fair trader. I don't believe in free trade as they define it. I believe that the slave policy of the 1800s and the illegal immigration and the trade policy all are for the same purpose, which is to allow corporations to access unpaid, underpaid, or unregulated labor in order to make excessive profits. At the same token, I was a member of the U.S. Chamber Board, and I believe that businesses need to be able to function without regulations that strangle them. And if you strangle American regulations, particularly with environmental regulations, all you do is transfer that pollution to other countries where it's far worse.
So, if I'm hearing you correctly, you believe that the issue is really that it doesn't offset. If you were to move, environmental regulations, and here in the U.S., sure, you have a cleaner country here, but the overall kind of global effect is kind of negated by whatever is happening overseas in the wake of that. At the same time, when you're talking about fair trade, what would you support policies that said that American companies couldn't do business with people that weren't that are on foreign soil, not adhering to similar laws and regulations in the United States that the United States and companies here already have to exist under?
I think I wouldn't say that. What I would say is I would be in favor of tariffs on production of products in other countries that don't have the same environmental stewardship standards and the same labor standards that we have, that would more even the playing field, or at least go in that direction. George Washington himself said that that we should place a tariff on imported goods that causes the cost of that product to be equivalent to what it costs us to produce it here. I think that's a very hard thing to do, but that's directionally the way I see it. I don't see it, to quantify what I'm saying for you, it's not just words. In 1980 or so, both the U.S. and China had 1 billion tons of production of coal, which is considered the problem for climate change. Well, we began to pass policies and regulate the coal industry, and we pushed it down to several hundred million. Maybe it's down 40% from 1 billion to 600 million, we'll call it, just directionally. The Chinese burn is up to 4 billion. So by over-regulating the U.S. economy, or the U.S. production of and use of coal, and then going to China and allowing those products to come in the country without a tariff, we increased CO2 emissions in the world by 3 or 4-fold. And yet we claimed that we were cleaning the environment. It's far worse when you get into mercury, arsenic, NOx emissions, sulfur emissions, or into other toxic emissions. We spend a fortune in this country trying to to stop the emission of 40 tons of mercury, while the Chinese were emitting 4,000 tons of mercury. So if we're truly looking for a cost benefit effect or ratio on improving the environment, we would never regulate U.S. production of anything.
Now, you mentioned kind of two different approaches there, it felt like. Would you rather deregulate these industries here in the United States or slap tariffs on to foreign competitors who are not adhering to those same labor and environmental structures?
If you really want to do what the best thing is, you'll find the sweet spot where the cost of each one is properly selected. There are things in the United States that are ridiculous, like the drinking water in the EPA office in Washington, D.C. doesn't meet the standard of being drinkable. You've got streams or operations that are being shut down because of excessive selenium discharge, which the selenium is naturally occurring in those areas, and it's just unusually high sometimes. So you've got nonsensical regulations that drive American jobs out, but you've also got sensical laws that are necessary to keep the environment sound. Same thing's true in China. You've got, some things are just terribly, ridiculously polluting. You can't even breathe in Beijing many days, and yet they're not doing anything about it. So it's a situation where there's low-hanging fruit, and if we go pick up the low-hanging fruit, we can both improve the U.S. economy, the U.S. way of life, and improve the world's environment at the same time.
I'll throw you a curveball here, moving away from trade policy, but you mentioned issues with the drinking water in D.C., which, having lived in D.C., I'm very familiar with. One of the things that kind of continuously handicaps the district on any number of issues, frankly, it is having to, even if the mayor and city council, or even if the voters through a ballot initiative pass something, it still usually has to be allocated through Congress and often signed off on by the president. There's a growing movement for statehood for the District of Columbia. Is that something you would support? Would you support either full statehood or increased autonomy for the district and for its residents?
It's not something I've given much thought to, so I'm always hesitant to say what I would do if I studied it closely. But off the cuff, I would say that I would support statehood. I've never really understood why the people of D.C. are not, equal in terms of, taxation without representation, as they call it, and so forth. So off the cuff, I would agree. I'd have to hear people's arguments that are on the other side of that.
The people in DC, I can guarantee to you, agree with you, but they don't understand why either. And that goes into kind of a secondary question that's been springing off of that, which is the populated territories of the United States. Obviously, we've saw a massive economic crisis in Puerto Rico. The kind of convoluted nature of them being a territory and not a state made it very difficult to figure out the best way to allocate aid and resources. And we saw that crisis kind of exasperated, of course, through natural disaster after that. There's a movement both in those territories and here in the United States to let the people there have a say on either full independence or on joining as a full state of the Union. Do you have a preference on that? And would you try to take action to move them out of that territorial status?
I don't think I would take any action, but my understanding, and it could be wrong because I think I read it somewhere, but the Puerto Ricans do not want statehood, and I'm not sure why they don't want statehood. But if that's true, then I wouldn't be wanting to force them to accept statehood. At the same time, if they're content to be a territory, I would stay there. If they wanted their freedom, I think you'd have to give it a great deal of consideration.
And the issue is obviously it's difficult. Puerto Rico's had a number of referendums for decades. Often they were choosing to remain a territory, and the last two times it was up for a vote there, they chose to become a state. Republicans in Congress refused to accept that petition out of fear of changing partisan balance, from my understanding, which doesn't seem like a good reason to me. Do you think that those types of decisions should be made based off of how it would affect partisan politics, or should it be made on how it would best affect Americans living in a certain area?
That's a very tough question because, obviously it should be based on what's best for both parties. And I don't know that I would bring property or bring these places like Puerto Rico into statehood with in a blind way. I'd have to look at each one of them and think about whether that made sense for the country and made sense for them. But it wouldn't be based on political considerations. It's just that if you were going to bring Puerto Rico in, are you going to end up with another welfare state, and are you going to end up with even more of an unbalanced budget and more economic problems in the U.S.? So I would be looking at both considerations, whether it's how it affects the country and how it affects the territory.
Because and right now, I mean, it's an interesting situation, right? Because they are American citizens. They come here. They if they were to relocate to a state, there's not a terribly long process that would be any different than, say, moving from Hawaii to California. And they immediately are able to vote in presidential elections. They have a voice in Congress, and they start paying taxes. That's one of the big differences, of course, is that right now the territories, while still U.S. citizens, they are not paying the same rates of taxation that the rest of the U.S. is. And that itself has been a separate item of conversation. I mean, first off, what would a tax policy under a Blankenship administration look like, and how would that affect the different regions, both within the lower 48 as well as kind of extraneous American holdings?
Again, I'm not familiar with the numbers, and so I don't know what taxes they're paying, what benefits from the U.S. they're getting, whether they're getting road money. They're obviously getting the protection of the U.S. military, but I don't know what benefits they're getting as opposed to what they're paying, if anything. So I would have to acquaint myself with that. It's not an issue that I see as a front burner issue in the United States, given all the other problems that we have internally.
What about broader tax policy, though? What types of tax initiatives would you try to pursue that would affect all Americans, regardless of geography?
Well, I think the biggest thing that we've made a mistake over the years is the way that we tax corporations and allow them to avoid taxes by where they're incorporated in Ireland or somewhere like that. Trump has fixed some of that. For a long time, the largest tax on anything imported was if you imported a U.S. dollar that you made overseas, which made no sense at all, that we would tax 50, 60%, whatever it was at the time, of a dollar being returned to the United States. So the bottom line is we need to balance the budget, and it can be done, but it has to be done on both ends. I mean, Amazon making the money it makes without paying much, if any, American taxes and so forth is ridiculous, because they're driving all the other businesses out, and there's too many favors given to the multinational corporations like Walmart and so forth that allows them to drive the small community businesses out of business. And the coronavirus policy actually benefited Target, Walmart, Lowe's, Costco, and drove all the small merchants out of business. So there's a lot of government policy that's nonsensical, and to sit here and pick and choose which ones, I just know that the corruption and the nonsensical policies are destroying our country.
And that kind of, I think, ties into the other kind of banner issue, which is education. I mean, we have educational breakdowns across the country at every level, pre-K, all of primary school, and of course, higher education. What are some of the things that you would like to take action on in regards to education policy? How can we make things more affordable for adult students? And what would you like to do regarding children in K through 12 programs across the U.S.?
Again, I'm very much opposed to Common Core. I think the federal government's involvement in education has been terrible. I think the Department of Education should be eliminated. I think that we got to get back to teaching facts as opposed to teaching ideology. So the education system is very broken, and I think we're seeing that throughout the country. On the other hand, it should be easy to cut costs. Technology, instead of being used to cut costs, is being used to create more and more welfare state. But the technology today, these kids are learning more and know more at 15 years old than we knew when we were adults. So there's incredible advantages that the technology offers that we need to study and take full advantage of, and we need to get the federal government out of education as best we can.
Now, you mentioned something I thought was kind of interesting there. You mentioned being against Common Core, and you said that we should be focusing on teaching facts as opposed to ideology. A lot of proponents of Common Core would say basically the same thing. They would say the necessity of having a kind of a nationalized standard for curriculum is that far too often at local levels, there are far too many different types of groups from across the political and ideological spectrum who get says on everything from textbook approval to, what version of history is being taught. So why would you oppose that type of national standardization if that's your ultimate goal?
Well, I think decentralizing education and having it be disparate from place to place is not all bad. I think that we want people to be exposed in different teachings and so forth. Having a central control over what children are taught and having the textbooks, read the way the current administration wants to read them is bad policy. We need things like Common Core math. What little bit I've looked at it, I think it just takes away from common sense of how math ought to be done. But when I have looked through some of these textbooks, even if it be something that is controversial as climate change, it's not taught as a theory, it's taught as a fact, and it's not known to be a fact. So I'm very opposed to the federal government dictating exactly what children are going to be taught.
Well, you're talking about climate change. I'm assuming you're talking about the man's role in causing an accelerated climate change. Is that what you're referencing?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but you say that that would not be a fact. It's not something you would want taught in schools, but there's broad scientific consensus on that.
Well, you say that because you've been taught that, but I don't know if you've read all the documents and articles on it. There's a lot of question about what went on in the United Nations with the email gate, the placement of where the thermometers are and all sorts of things. And there's no, as far as I can see, there's no exact science that says that the amount of man-made CO2 emissions is changing the temperature of the Earth. I mean, you'll see just recently, for example, the heat wave we had last week, they'll talk about it's the hottest it's been in 100 years. Well, 100 years ago, we didn't have a lot of CO2 emissions. And yet they'll talk about that as if that's proof that we're having climate change. When Katrina hit, there was constant talk about how many hurricanes were going to come in the next 10 years, and there's going to be record levels and so forth. It didn't happen.
It did happen. I'm sorry, Mr. Blankenship, but a couple of things here. I have read and studied this quite a bit, and one, I want to start by saying there are always questions in science. There are questions about whether you physically exist right now. That's the nature of science. But there is broader consensus within the scientific community on man's role in climate change than there is on smoking cigarettes giving you cancer and an increased risk of heart attack. I mean, this has been the documentation on the greenhouse gas effect goes back 120 years. This is something that really became politicized, and we discuss as something that's we kind of accelerate and amplify these dissenting voices far more than the credence of what they're actually saying necessarily would merit or demand because of the political atmosphere around it. But we're talking about this is not something that was necessarily taught in school. I'm gonna be honest, I went to school in Arizona. We didn't really talk about climate change here. This is something that you actually have to go and study at a higher level. But that to me, right off the bat, seems like an example of why we would need a national set of standards.
Let me make it clear for you. The United States represents between 4 and 5% of the world's population. It could disappear tomorrow, and CO2 emissions would not go down. They would soon go up. So the problem is that even if you are convinced that the science is right, and if you think the world's going to overheat, the oceans are going to rise, and the world's going to end, you would do the exact opposite of what's being done. As I noted earlier, we had 1 billion tons of U.S. coal production and burn in the United States in 1980, and the Chinese did as well. But since then, the Chinese and the rest of the world have greatly increased their CO2 emissions from coal burn. It's one of those things where you can pretty easily tell that the people who are advocating that CO2 emissions are going to destroy the world don't believe it themselves, or they wouldn't support the trade policy, they wouldn't support regulating American businesses out of business, or even Western European businesses out of business, because all the actions they're taking increase CO2 emissions, they don't decrease CO2 emissions.
Well, some would say that was a more of a breakdown in policy. I mean, let's remember that the push towards free trade in this country was really, really based on the idea, I mean, one, of how creating a new economy, creating newer, higher paying jobs, that was one of the big things we were sold through the 90s, right? That this would move people out of manufacturing, but it would move them into more kind of white collar middle class positions through retraining. That didn't turn out to be true, but that was,
using your words, there was an economic consensus, just like there's a scientific consensus on climate change. What the majority of the economists believed, or the majority of those in the U.S. said they believed, it turned out not to be true. We wouldn't be 27 trillion in debt. I personally believe that will ultimately be the truth, that those that believe that man-made CO2 emissions are changing the temperature of the earth will come to that conclusion as well, but it might be 20 or 30 years.
Well, but you're also, I mean, comparing the study of economics to science is not necessarily accurate.
Well,
I would say that it borders on disingenuous. Now, the study of economics, the field of economics, has done a lot in the last, say, 30 years to move away from being guided primarily by academic theory and more into kind of controlled, data-driven numbers. But there are still a lot of variables there that people don't understand, and there's so much based on individual decision when you're looking at the micro level of it, that it's very different than figuring out, say, physics or biology, or in this case.
Let me tell you that, the word you use is that there's more variability in economics than in climate change. That's far from true. There's a whole lot more variability and a whole lot less known about the variability of climate change than there is about economics. There's so many things going on in the world, on Earth, in terms of evaporation rates, whether the Arctic's getting colder or the Antarctic's getting hotter, or vice versa, and what is going on. It's almost impossible to even identify all the variables. And but bottom line is that destroying the United States economy and destroying the Americans' way of life, which represent 4 to 5% of the world's population, on the basis of climate change, is not sensical, because we are not doing anything that actually reduces CO2 emissions on a worldwide basis.
Well, and I think that's a different selling point than saying it doesn't exist and that you don't believe in it, because you could validly make an argument that other actors on the world stage have not done their fair share when it comes to combating climate change, that they have taken advantage of the fact that markets like the United States and parts of Europe and Japan, for example, have been pushing environmental regulation and trying to clean up their production, while at the same time other countries have gone in the other direction because it's been cheaper for them to do so, and they've been able to undercut American companies and American production. Those are not necessarily linked to whether or not, climate change is happening. I think we can see that it's happening, frankly. At this point, I don't think the average person even needs to fully understand the science to understand that something has been different with the weather just in my lifetime, which is not terribly long.
I apologize for laughing about it, but climate and weather will go up and down in long cycles, longer cycles than you've been alive. So how it's going in this small 20, 30, 40-year cycle, my 60, 70-year cycle is irrelevant to the argument that the climatologists make that the world is changing in over 100 or 200 or 1,000 or 1,000,000 years. We know that CO2 levels were higher in the world in the days of the dinosaur than they are now, and things did quite well. We know that God and nature have put in place that plants absorb, oxygen and CO2 and emit oxygen, and we do the opposite, and therefore they bounce. We know that the oceans evaporate quicker when you have warmer temperatures and mitigate the temperature. So there's a control within the Earth that's put there naturally that is more likely to impact whether climate change becomes meaningful or catastrophic or not than the American businesses going out of business to make a small, extremely small decrease in CO2 emissions. So, and we could argue the science, but I accept your position that it's much easier, much more provable, and much more mathematical to say that what we're doing is not addressing it, whether we believe it or not. I could make lots of points about whether it's occurring or not, but there's no denying that U.S. EPA policies have not decreased CO2 emissions, they've increased CO2 emissions.
And I think that, yeah, there's consensus on that. I think there's drastically different consensus on what needs to be done next. But I definitely would say that there's consensus on the idea that we are not headed in the right direction. Either economically for the viability of the country or environmentally for the viability of the world.
Yeah, basically what I would say, as long as you have 600,000 street people and whatever it is, 22 million people in the U.S. living below poverty line, and 1 billion people in Africa that don't have electricity or potable water, climate change is not on the top of my list.
As we're getting towards the end of the program, Don, I like to try to wrap these up with a similar question. Throughout the course of your candidacy, what is it that you are most trying to convey to the American people?
That the two major parties are drama parties. They're not going to fix the problem, because if they fix the problem, they won't have anything to entertain you with. They're like professional wrestling. They wrestle and then they take your money, and there's a good guy and a bad guy, but they go home together and have dinner together and run around together and make sure that both are doing well while the American people are not doing well. It's a very, very difficult problem because they'll have billions of dollars. There may be $4 billion spent on this year's election. It's gotten to the point that a non-establishment person can't win. But until we elect a non-establishment person, we're not going to fix the problem. And it has to be somebody other than President Trump, because he doesn't have the ability to process and deal with the issues in what he calls the swamp, because he gets too tangled up in them.
Don, thank you so much for coming on the program. Again, that's Don Blankenship, Constitution Party candidate for president. As always, I'm Alex Cack, and this has been Sorry for Rambling. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.